There is a myth about samurai that has survived 500 years. It is the myth of the honorable warrior, bound by an unbreakable code, noble in defeat, graceful in victory. We see this image everywhere, in films, in books, in the imagination of the modern world. But this myth is a mask. And beneath that mask lies something far more troubling, far more honest, and far more useful than the romantic story we have been told. The code we call Bushido was not written in ancient scrolls. It was codified, systematized, and weaponized in the 17th century, long after the samurai's most violent era had ended. It was a tool designed to control, to dominate, and to transform human beings into instruments of obedience. And here is what most people do not understand. The samurai did not follow Bushido because it was inherently good. They followed it because it worked. It broke their will. It rebuilt them. And it made them useful to power. This is the story we need to tell, because buried inside this brutal truth is a principle that can transform your life, not through nobility, but through radical honesty about what discipline actually costs. Chapter 1. The Illusion. Let us begin with a man named Honda Koji. He was a businessman in Tokyo, successful by every external measure. He had built a company, he had money, he had respect, but he lived in constant contradiction. At work, he was aggressive, strategic, willing to compromise others to advance himself. At home, he was distant, performing the role of husband and father without truly inhabiting it. In public, he presented strength. In private, he was fractured. He had adopted the modern version of Bushido without understanding its deeper mechanics. He believed that discipline meant suppressing weakness, that honor meant never showing vulnerability, that strength meant isolation. And this belief was slowly destroying him. One morning, Honda Koji found himself sitting in meditation, something he had read about in business books and practiced for 3 minutes every other week. And in that moment of stillness, he realized something that disturbed him deeply. He had never actually examined why he believed what he believed. He had inherited a code from his culture, from his upbringing, from the world around him, and he had spent his entire adult life trying to fit himself into it, like a sword being forced into a sheath that was too small. The code was not serving him. He was serving the code. This is where the unmasking begins, because Bushido, in its historical reality, was never about the individual finding meaning or purpose. It was about the individual surrendering their meaning to something larger, their clan, their lord, their duty. The samurai were not free men pursuing honor. They were controlled men, trained from childhood to suppress their own desires, their own judgment, their own will. And the genius of this system was that it made them believe the suppression was noble. It transformed slavery into virtue. Chapter 2. The Mechanism of Control. To understand how Bushido worked as a system of control, we must look at one of its core principles: absolute obedience to the Lord. This was not presented as oppression. It was presented as the highest expression of loyalty. A samurai would follow his lord's order even unto death, even unto dishonor, even unto the destruction of his own moral judgment. The code demanded not just action, but the surrender of the right to choose action. And this is crucial. The samurai did not experience this as slavery because the code had reframed slavery as freedom. By obeying completely, the samurai was told he was liberated from the chaos of individual choice. He was told he was part of something sacred. This mechanism appears everywhere in human systems. Religious orders use it. Military institutions use it. Corporate cultures use it. The mechanism is always the same. Take a person's desire for meaning, belonging, and purpose, and offer them a pre-made framework that promises to satisfy all three, as long as they stop thinking for themselves. The brilliance is that it works. It genuinely does provide relief from the burden of choice. And that relief feels like enlightenment until the moment it becomes a prison. Honda Koji began to see this mechanism operating inside himself. His company had its own code, unwritten but deeply felt. Loyalty to the organization meant sacrificing his own time, his own health, his own relationships. Excellence meant never admitting uncertainty. Leadership meant projecting an image of infallibility. And like the samurai of old, he had been told that this was virtue, that this was strength, that to question it was weakness. But the cost was beginning to show. His marriage was hollow. His children barely knew him. His body was failing. He had achieved everything the code promised, and he felt empty. Chapter 3. The Shadow of Honor. Now we must confront something darker. Bushido did not merely control behavior, it also justified cruelty. The code contained within it a system of hierarchy so absolute that those at the bottom had no protection. A samurai could strike a commoner without consequence. A lord could demand the death of a vassal without explanation. These were not exceptions to Bushido. They were logical extensions of it. When obedience is absolute and hierarchy is sacred, then brutality becomes inevitable. The code did not prevent atrocity. It enabled it. This is what we must understand about any absolute code. It does not protect the vulnerable. It protects the powerful. It tells the weak that their suffering is meaningful, that their submission is honorable, that their erasure is necessary for the greater good. And across centuries, this lie has been repeated in every form of rigid social structure. But here is the difficult truth. We carry this code within ourselves. We have internalized the hierarchy. We have learned to be brutal to ourselves in the name of discipline. We tell ourselves that pain is purifying, that suffering builds character, that to rest is to fail, that to question is to betray. Honda Koji discovered this within his own consciousness. He had become his own tyrant. He had constructed an internal code so rigid that he could no longer be flexible, could no longer be human. He worked until he was exhausted. He pushed harder when he was broken. He saw his own needs as weakness to be overcome, and he had taught this to others. He had created a culture in his company where people learned to suppress themselves, to perform strength, to sacrifice authenticity for the appearance of control. He had become the Lord, and he had never questioned whether the code he served was actually worth serving. Chapter 4. The Unmasking. But here is where the story shifts. Because embedded within Bushido, hidden beneath all the ideology of obedience and hierarchy, there is a genuine truth. And to find it, we must first tear away all the lies. The lie that strength means hardness. The lie that discipline means control. The lie that honor means obedience. The lie that self-mastery means self-suppression. When we remove the mask, what remains? What remains is this. Real discipline is not about becoming rigid. It is about becoming aware. Real strength is not about never breaking. It is about understanding how and when to break and how to rebuild. Real honor is not about following a code that you have never examined. It is about creating a code that is actually yours, based on honest examination of who you are and what you value. And real self-mastery is not about controlling the self. It is about transcending the need for control through understanding. This is what the ancient masters actually understood beneath all the mythology. Miyamoto Musashi, when he wrote his final teachings, the Dokodo, was not writing about obedience. He was writing about walking alone. He was writing about the discipline required to think for yourself, to trust yourself, to act from your own conviction rather than from external authority. The real samurai, the truly dangerous ones, were not those who obeyed best. They were those who understood the code so completely that they could transcend it. They could follow the form without being enslaved by it. And that is a very different thing. Honda Koji began his unmasking by asking a simple question. Whose values am I actually living? Not which values has my culture told me to live, but which values have I chosen, consciously, deliberately, as my own? And this question was harder than he expected, because he realized he had never truly chosen anything. He had been following codes his entire life. His family's code, his culture's code, his profession's code, his religion's code. And beneath all those codes, he did not know who he was. The mask was so complete that there was no face underneath. Chapter 5. The Discipline of Honesty. The path out of this cage is not to abandon discipline, it is to redirect it, to use the same intensity, the same focus, the same unwillingness to compromise that the samurai brought to obedience, and apply it instead to radical honesty. This is harder than following an external code. It is far more painful. Because an external code tells you what to do, radical honesty requires you to question everything, including your own survival strategies, your own comforts, your own defenses. Honda Koji began this practice in small ways. He started by observing himself without judgment, not trying to fix anything, not trying to become better, just watching. He noticed the moments he performed rather than being. He noticed the times he spoke from fear rather than from conviction. He noticed where he had learned to abandon his own judgment in favor of external authority. And he began to understand that this was not weakness. This was survival. As a child, he had learned that obedience was safety, that conformity was love, that suppression of self was the price of belonging. These were not character flaws. They were adaptations, and they had served him. But adaptation is not identity. A tool that once saved your life can become a prison if you forget it is a tool. The discipline Honda Koji needed was not the discipline to obey more perfectly. It was the discipline to observe his own obedience, to understand its origins, and then to make a conscious choice about when it served him and when it did not. This is what real samurai mastery looked like when stripped of the mythology. It was not mindless obedience. It was conscious choice, made from a place of deep self-knowledge. It was the discipline to think, the discipline to question, the discipline to stand alone if necessary when the code asked you to betray yourself. Chapter 6. The Return. 3 years into this practice, Honda Koji was a different man, not because he had achieved some transcendent state, not because he had become enlightened, but because he had become honest. He had examined his code, he had questioned its origins, he had decided which parts served him and which parts enslaved him, and he had had the courage to do something that Bushido never allowed. He had changed his mind. He had changed his values. He had changed his life. His company was smaller now. He had let go of the people he had hired because they were useful rather than because he believed in them. He had restructured his work around what actually mattered to him, not what the code told him should matter. His relationships were deeper because he was no longer performing in them. He was present. He was uncertain. He was vulnerable. And paradoxically, this made him stronger, because he was no longer wasting energy maintaining a false image. His body was healthier because he had stopped using it as a weapon to be tested and pushed beyond its limits. He had learned to use discipline not to overcome himself, but to understand himself. And here is the final unmasking, the truth that lies beneath Bushido and beneath all rigid codes. The greatest discipline is not the discipline to obey. It is the discipline to be honest, to look directly at reality without flinching, to examine yourself without self-deception, to question the code you have inherited, even when questioning carries a cost, to build a life based on your own conscious choice, rather than on someone else's definition of virtue. The samurai understood power. And the deepest power is not the power to dominate others. It is the power to know yourself, to master yourself, not by suppression, but by honest, unflinching examination of what you are and what you want. This is the invitation that Bushido, when truly understood, extends to us. not to follow blindly, but to examine thoroughly, not to obey without question, but to question everything, including our obedience, not to suppress ourselves in the name of strength, but to strengthen ourselves through radical honesty about who we are. The code itself does not matter, but the discipline required to examine any code, to transcend it, to become truly autonomous in your thinking and your choices, that discipline will remake you.